In this expert interview, we'll be speaking with Dr. Brian Knutson, who's an associate professor of psychology at Stanford University and the director of the Symbiotic Project on Affective Neuroscience. And he, as one of the leading figures in this area, will speak with us about the field of neuroeconomics and emotion. So Dr. Knutson received his bachelor degree in psychology and comparative religion from Trinity University and his PhD from Stanford University, after which he did postdoctoral research in affective neuroscience at the UCSF Medical School and the National Institute of Health. His laboratory uses multiple methods, including psychometrics, psychophysiology, brain imaging, and pharmacology, to investigate neural mechanisms that underlie emotional experience, and he also explores implications of this work for clinical disorders of affect and addiction, as well as for economic decision-making. Their discovery that neural activity correlates with expected value and can be used to predict choice, including financial risk-taking and product purchases, has helped seed new and exciting interdisciplinary fields, including neuroeconomics, neurofinance, and neuromarketing. Dr. Knutson has received Young Investigator Awards from the American Psychiatric Association, the National Alliance for Research on Schizophrenia and Depression, and the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research. He's also a fellow of the American Psychological Society and Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research. His research is funded by grants from several organizations, including the National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation. He's been invited to speak about his research in psychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, economics, finance, and marketing departments around the world. And his laboratory's research is regularly featured in top journals and popular media outlets. So I now turn to our very special Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Brian Knutson. So welcome, Brian. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Thanks, June. Thanks for having me.
So I know we're all curious to know a bit about what got you first interested in emotion. I know that you came to this in a path that isn't typical of everyone, and I'd love to hear your story.
Right. So this sort of dates me, but when I was a psychology graduate student, people talked about emotion and the brain somewhat, but they never talked about the two together. So I studied emotion at that time, facial expression of emotion. And I went to work with a guy named Paul Ekman, who studies facial expression of emotion. And I was a postdoc in his lab, and he noticed that I was spending a lot of time taking classes in the medical school. And he said to me, you can continue doing this, you're doing your work, it's fine, but if you really want to do this, go this route, then you need to work with somebody who thinks about the brain and thinks about emotion. And there are only 3 people in the world who do that right now. One was Richie Davidson, another was Joe Ledoux, another was Jaak Panksepp. So I decided to take the risk and go work with Jaak in Ohio. And he was very interesting at that time because he was claiming that animals had emotion, that you could model it in rats, all these very radical things at the time. So I did. I went and worked with Jaak, and I really got my hands dirty working with the brain and neuropharmacology. And based on that, that sort of sent me off on this weird trajectory of affective neuroscience. I ended up at the National Institute of Health for another postdoc, and there I got exposure to brain imaging. My boss basically said, I have this time, do you want to do something with it? And that then got me into brain imaging. So I've always been interested in emotion, but the neuroscience part came later.
Very cool. So I'd love to ask you a bit more about your current research now. So I mean, we can all relate to some extent to the way that emotions shift the way we spend money or how our economic situations influence how we feel in the moment. And your work is really cool here because it looks at this sort of neuroeconomics of emotion. So this bridges fields of psychology, neuroscience, and economics, and it's this very timely and exciting field to so many people. And at the same time, it's this rapidly developing and new field as well. And so I just wondered if you could share with us some of the kind of scientific puzzles that are gripping people in studying these kinds of questions.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very exciting time. This technology for looking into the brain, not only at the cortical level, but deep in the subcortical level, at a second-to-second temporal resolution, has really only been with us for the past decade or so. So as we're discovering new things, we're also innovating new methods. And that doesn't just apply to the fancy magnets or the head coils, but also to how you design the study, how you analyze your data. Timing is really important. And in fact, one thing that we've been focusing on is, can you not only see arousal in the brain, but can you see valence? Which seems very basic from an emotional perspective, but really it's a question that's at the root of all studies of affect and emotion. And the reason we're so focused on valence, meaning good versus bad, is because we think that not only will it allow us to see how people are reacting to things, but also what they're about to do. And so we've specifically focused on two emotional states, which is rather limited, really, to be honest. Two emotional states that we think are evoked when people anticipate uncertain good events or uncertain bad events. We call them positive arousal and negative arousal, and they fit right into this affective framework of thinking about people's experience. So positive arousal involves emotions like excitement, energy, even pride. Negative arousal involves emotions like anxiety, irritability. And so these kinds of emotions are especially important to us because we think that they occur not only in response to something that just happened, an outcome, but also in anticipation of things that have not yet happened. So they're truly psychological, and we also think that they drive behavior. So they will push you towards approach or avoidance, respectively. So they will, in essence, allow us to predict whether somebody will approach or avoid a situation.
Fascinating. So what do you think then are some of the major challenges researchers are going to face in this field of neuroeconomics of emotion?
So one of the challenges, a lot of them are sort of the same challenges that most emotion researchers face, but there's an additional layer. So the same challenges that emotional researchers face is that they want to measure something that often is assessed with self-report and correlate it with either, behavior or skin conductance, physiology, something like that. And those correlations can be pretty loose. So people aren't always aware of, I think, what they're feeling. Sometimes they can act in an emotional way and not be aware of it, or come up with an explanation that really isn't relevant to why they behave that way. And in fact, we can set up situations like that in the lab. So one of the problems is that things don't always hang together very well. Another problem, which is unique to our situation, is the problem of timing. Everything that we do, we have to make predictions not only about what will happen where, but also when, especially when it comes to anticipating things. And so we have to think very carefully about the timing of events that happens in our both in our experiments and our analyses, and we have to be precise about that. And that's something that in psychology, some people have thought about, but really we've lacked the technology to sort of really link up physiological measures online with emotional tendencies and emotional self-reports. And what I mean by that is that you would want to have sort of a self-report of good versus bad sort of on an ongoing scale, but the very act of doing that kind of a rating may interfere with the emotion. And so there are a lot of technical issues that we need to resolve to get things on the same time scale so we can really test our hypotheses about how affect matches up with brain activity.
Well, it's interesting you're talking about timing and kind of the temporal focus of the studies that we do, because one of the many amazing things you've done in your research, but one of them has really been to parse apart the anticipation from the consumption of rewards. And so I know this is something that is relevant to just a host of different fields, not only in affective science, but in clinical science, thinking about economic decision making. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what this distinction is between wanting something and liking something.
Right. So I joke with people that a lot of my neuroimaging experiments are really built around rat experiments. And it's really true. Like going in and studying rats and their basic motivational states really informs even our studies of how people decide whether to invest or not, or whether they want to buy an item or not. Obviously, rats are not doing this, but they're deciding, I want to get that food, I want to avoid that predator. And we think that those motivational surrogates are not only conserved, but are used by all of us in our day-to-day decisions. I want to make sure I get the answer to your question right. The implications of this, what is the difference between wanting and liking? So one things in rats that's very interesting is by Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan, is he's been able to neurochemically and to some extent neuroanatomically dissociate wanting, what he calls wanting, from liking. And he does these clever experiments where he has rats eating food and he puts them on a plexiglass plate. He can observe their mouth movements. He can distinguish, the tasty movement of licking your lips to a sucrose solution from the disgust expression of gaping and spitting out things, which also human infants and humans show.
And typical expressions of Brian, too.
Yes, I often make these expressions. Unfortunately, my students complain about it, but I do. Yes, but so he can distinguish these as hedonic measures, what he calls liking, from actually how much food you eat. And what he finds is that if you give the rat a dopaminergic drug that stimulates dopamine, they'll eat more, they don't show more tasty expressions. If you give them an opiatergic drug, like heroin, they will actually not eat more, but they will show more lip smacking. So he can distinguish this so-called wanting from liking. And one idea that we've used his ideas and we've sort of extended them into the human realm is that the wanting is about appetitive motivation. It's about going out and getting good stuff. It has an evolutionary value. And the liking is different. It's about saying, okay, this was good, and now I should go for more of it. And so obviously those things should be correlated, but should happen at different points in a cycle of consuming something. First you have appetitive motivation. It gets you to go out and get good stuff. Then you have the liking. And that can feed back and inform the wanting. But the new developments in brain imaging have allowed us to actually just explicitly in time separate out when you want something from when you like it. And we haven't actually looked at taste so much. We've looked at money because we wanted to focus on the wanting component. And money is really great. It gives you lots of control.
Yeah, so I wondered if you actually wanted to say something about this. I mean, you developed a task that thousands of researchers have used, the monetary incentive delay task.
Yeah. So we developed this task because we were frustrated with other affective stimuli. We found them to be too variable, that people had variable reactions even to sugar water, to pictures and so forth. And so we thought, well, money should engage people, and in fact it does. And it should elicit affective responses. And in fact it does. That's a big advantage. And we've seen this not only in undergrads, but also in community samples and people all around the world. When they are anticipating a monetary gain, we see prominent positive arousal, we see neural responses. When they're anticipating losing money, we see prominent negative arousal, not positive. Mm-hmm. And we also see other neural responses to that. And so it just so happened advantageously that money turned out to be a great brain imaging tool to elicit activity in these motivational circuits. And so we did that work funded by the NIH, and they funded us because they wanted us to be able to visualize these circuits that have also been implicated, not just in wanting and so forth, but also in psychiatric disorders. And so there's sort of two levels of what we do. One level is what I call the phasic level. It's sort of like the decisions we make on an everyday basis. The other is what I'd call the tonic level, which is sort of individual differences in the responsiveness of these circuits. And that's a level at which people are interested in these tasks, not just to understand economic decision-making, but to try to disentangle the different symptom profiles that people's psychiatric disorders have, and maybe visualize what the overall responsiveness of these circuits and try to understand whether that can help us to predict how they'll do with a therapy or a drug regimen or whether they'll improve.
Such important clinical health implications of the work you do and of the tasks you developed. I know many people use it, and myself in my lab, trying to parse apart the nature of, reward in people suffering from mood disorders, thanks to your task.
Well, I hope it will be useful. It's a little scary. I mean, I didn't think it would be so widely used when we developed it. And you never know with neuroimaging what's going to be a good probe. That's part of the reason we have to do all this localization work, is that, you never know actually how the brain is responding to things. And this is an issue, just going back to emotion research. We don't know actually how the brain is emotionally responding to things. We don't know if it's doing so in a dimensional way, in a categorical way, if it's not doing so at all. Some people are arguing that you can't even see value in the brain, and this seems unlikely to me, but it could be true. So on the one hand, there's all this promise. Maybe we can tease apart psychiatric symptom profiles, we can predict choice. On the other hand, there's still a lot of open questions about how actually is the brain responding to things emotionally, and how can we visualize that using the tools that we have.
So lots of unanswered mysteries, which keeps academics and researchers in the field busy, right?
Keep us busy.
So you talked a little bit about how this work has implications for psychopathology and mental health. Do you think it has important implications also for economic decision making?
I do. I just got back from NYU where I was talking about neuromarketing. Mm. So there have been all these kinds of fields, neuro-fields emerging from this, and a lot of promises, by not necessarily by scientists, but by people who run businesses or the press. And, there's a lot of hype, to be honest. But I do think there is promise. And the reason I think there is promise is that we can actually, at this point, take these signals out of the brain, these anticipatory signals that we associate with positive arousal and negative arousal, and use them to predict better than chance whether people will decide to buy something, whether they will decide to take a financial risk, whether they'll decide to take a gamble, for instance. And we don't have to know, this is without knowing anything about who you are, what you saw, or your explicit stated preferences for those items. So this is pretty exciting. This is almost like mind reading, if you will. And we know that these solutions generalize across people. So it's not just that I have a really good map of June's brain, but it's not going to work in my brain. So for us, this is very exciting because it gets at not just description and explanation, but also prediction and perhaps control, which are the goals of science. Right now, I'd say we're at about 75% in predicting what people will buy. And if we ask people what they like and how much they'll pay, I'd say we get a similar prediction. So, but there are other instances where people have predicted choice, even in the case that somebody has not said that they explicitly like something. So I'm thinking of a study by Greg Burns on adolescents listening to music and then trying to predict how well those songs sold 3 years later, and using nucleus accumbens activity to actually predict song sales, when adolescents' explicit ratings of liking did not predict the song sales. Those kinds of experiments are like science fiction, and they need to be replicated, obviously. But it's pretty interesting from the standpoint of applying the science.
Well, and you've also been applying science to try to understand how we anticipate affect and how that relates to financial risk-taking, too.
That's right, yeah. I mean, we think that using these methods, we can just get another window on anticipatory affect in people and use that to understand not only just minute-to-minute or second-to-second decisions, but also life financial outcomes. And, a lot of people have looked at health outcomes and emotional traits, and I think that's very important, actually, and understudied. But not many have looked at life financial outcomes, like, how many assets do you have, how many debts do you have, what is your risk preference profile. But in fact, it could be that these things are completely circumstantial. So that is that, the things that happen to you in life, and we all know that those can have a serious impact on your finances, matter quite a bit. But it also could be that there are enduring dispositional affective styles that influence your financial decision over and over and over, and that can have a cumulative effect on your life financial outcomes. And we've started indeed to find that some of our markers, both behavioral and neural, of affective style are linked to life financial outcomes. So we can find, for instance, that performance on a simple gain learning task is linked to assets, or performance on a simple loss learning task, which looks the same to a behaviorist, is linked to an absence of debts. This is one of the far-out findings that we have recently that we're replicating. But we can look at these affective profiles sort of at many levels, and that's exciting to me too. So we can not just be comfortable with asking people on a questionnaire the psychometrics, but also trying to link that to brain structure and brain function, and to distinguish it from other types of individual differences like working memory or reversal learning or things like that.
It seems like a really important theme in your work has really been just linking data across multiple levels of analysis to really get at the questions that are most important.
That's actually how I characterize our work to students. As I say, where our added value is, or what we seem to be good at, is saying, here's a really big effect up here. Here's another big effect down here. How are those connected? Are they connected at all? And it sounds really easy, but it's actually quite difficult because you have all these other effects at this level and at that level, and there's sparse connections. So only a few of those things are actually robustly connected. But I find it's really rewarding. It allows me to talk to and work with colleagues in other areas, and that's how I learn the fastest.
So when you think then about where the sort of future of the field is headed, do you think a big part is linking these disparate areas, or where do you see the future of emotion headed, in your opinion?
Wow. Well, I'm biased by, the direction we're going. So I will be really interested to listen to your other interviews and hear what other people say, be educated. Yeah. But of course, for us, what I want is this linking of the levels. So I want to see how is brain function connected to affective self-report, and how is that connected to choice, and how is that connected to life outcomes. I want that vertical linkage. And I want it to be empirical. I want it to have numbers. I want to have sort of transfer functions that we can use to say, okay, if this event happened, if dopamine fired, if they're likely to take this financial risk. And if they do that enough, they're likely to put more money in their bank or not, and that will have the following social impact. So it would be really cool to have a theory with that kind of power, that kind of cross-level power. So that's one thing on my wish list, is to have something like that.
That's a fantastic wish list item.
Hopefully. We'll see what the funding agencies think.
So then the last question I had for you is just, what kind of advice would you give students who are thinking about embarking in this kind of wild field, almost science fiction-like, as you said, of emotion?
Yes.
What would you tell them?
It's tricky, and I should have thought about this more before we talked. But because what I usually tell my students is, don't do what I did, which is, I literally spent 8 or 9 years without any interviews. So I graduated, with a PhD. I went into a postdoc. I was on the market, for 8 years. Nobody was interested in what I was doing, or they probably just thought it was too preliminary. And then suddenly, 8 interviews and 4 offers. So that was about the time I was publishing my brain imaging stuff. So for a while, it looked like, this guy is doing crazy stuff. And then suddenly, everybody's like, oh, this is feasible. We can do this. This is interesting. And so it's very hard to predict the zeitgeist. It's sort of like investing. It's hard to predict the market. And I don't know what the optimal strategy is. I almost think for a person like me, if you're like me, which probably many people are not, I had to have the intrinsic motivation to pull me through. And the conviction that what I was doing was really the right way to answer the question, which is, how do emotions work? I felt like I had to go to the neural level. I'm not sure if that's a good strategy now. I guess what I would say, the 2 things I would say are, get a good, strong effect, the behavioral effect, not a neural effect, that you can really tweak in different ways and explain and explore at different levels. That's one thing that I think is useful. Another thing is, get a good method and explore a new method that you can be an expert in. Because I think then you're not only an expert on some sort of field or effect that you've investigated, but to be an expert in a method is quite valuable, especially in neuroimaging, the way that things are advancing. Every year there are new things, and there are new things to explore. It's not as easy as it sounds, because you want to be an expert in a method that you think will have some longevity. But there are so many needs out there for better methods. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for students to become experts that way.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Brian. It was great hearing your thoughts. This concludes our Expert in Emotion interview series with Dr. Brian Knutson from Stanford University.